and welcome to Dialogue. Around 80 countries have signed a Ukraine peace proposal at a meeting in Switzerland. At the same time, Russia set out its own terms for ending the war in Ukraine. Has the peace conference brought us closer to peace? Is it the time for the related parties to come to the negotiating table? And what will be the key factors to bring about an end to the conflict? Join us for our discussion today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Peter Zalmayev, Director of Eurasia Democracy Initiative, Professor Glenn Diesen from University of South-Eastern Norway, and Anton Fedyashin, Associate Professor at History Department of American University. Welcome to Dialogue. So Peter, I will start with you. The meeting was billed as a peace conference to discuss how to end the conflict in Ukraine. Do you think the gathering has produced the desired result, or can we say, do you think Ukraine has get what he wanted?
Well, obviously, no one was under any illusions that this would lead to any, peace agreement or even create significant diplomatic pressure on Russia, considering that Russia is trying to discredit this meeting and come up with an alternative sort of platform for potential peace talks. But the one thing that it did do is reaffirm Ukraine's territorial integrity, as was borne out by speeches by the world leaders that gathered there. The document, as you know, was the joint communique was signed by over 80 governments and organizations. It did bring focus back on Ukraine. Now that for the past 8 months, Ukraine's been sort of vying for the world's attention with Israel and Gaza. And finally, I think it was important to show that despite Vladimir Putin's claims and efforts to win the hearts and minds of the global South, a significant portion of that so-called global South has been brought on board and was in expressed support for Ukraine's territorial integrity. So a highly symbolic event, but once again, let no one be under any illusions that it would produce any concrete results.
Well, with that said, the communique does call for all parties to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. So Anton, in that sense, how much weight does it carry? As Peter has mentioned, at least it highlights, this Ukraine issue, instead of being overshadowed by the Gaza crisis, and politically some, diplomatic pressure on Russia.
I don't think, unfortunately, for the Ukrainians, it's going to bring an enormous amount of actual diplomatic pressure on Russia. And that's because there are two problems with this conference. Peter's right, by the way, about its symbolic significance, but wars aren't won and peace isn't achieved through symbolism. Wars are won on the field. They are won through economic productivity, and peace is achieved when warring parties come together. So to have a conference about peace in Ukraine without one of the two countries at war being present is an exercise in symbolism, but not much beyond that. The Russians are going to have to be brought in eventually to actually start negotiating. The calculus in the West and in Ukraine for now, within Zelensky's government, to be even more precise, is that somehow conditions will improve and Ukraine can approach the Russians from a position of strength, or at least from a better position where they are now. Unfortunately, anyone who's following what's going on the front lines, I think will find it hard to see how Ukraine is going to improve its positions. It's running out of men. It's running out of weapons. What the West is supplying is simply not enough. And most importantly, the Russians are not only militarily outproducing all of NATO put together, but as the World Bank just concluded, they had the fastest and the largest economic growth in Europe for last year. It looks like this year they may achieve the same. And the sanctions have fallen through. So again, symbolism is important, but ultimately it will be diplomacy that will put an end to this. And diplomacy with Russia was not mentioned terribly much during this peace conference. So I have a feeling that, unfortunately, having come to an end, this will be, over the next few days, sort of forgotten, and things will go back to the usual. And that's not good news for Ukraine.
Here, Glenn, Russia was not invited to the conference. What is the justification? In normal situation, you would assume that both parties to the conflict, to the war, would be invited, and probably something will be done to force them, in a sense, to talk to each other to end the conflict. But it's not the case.
Yeah, and this is some very common tactic by NATO, actually, because for years we had the NATO-Russia Council, and the usual way this council worked was not for everyone to sit down, discuss their mutual concerns and come to a common agreement. Instead, NATO would always meet first, make sure that everyone took a common position, and then meet Russia. And at this point, they wouldn't actually have much to talk about anymore, because there would be little room for maneuver since everyone already reached an agreement. And the point was always to put max pressure on Russia. Now, this is, of course, this can be seen as attempting to pursue this same model, but then you would assume there would be another conference where they actually include the Russians. But overall, it seems very much that, yes, already been said that the purpose of this was merely to draw attention to it, that Israel and Palestine has taken much of the media spotlight for the past 8 months, and they simply wanted to draw attention to this. And it does seem strange not inviting Russia, but not even discussing Russian security concerns and demands at all. This seems to be not really what you would even be able to then define as a peace summit. So from my perspective, I think this was the main idea. It was more of a rallying call, attempting to rally the global South against Russia. And in the past, when they've had this kind of peace summits, as they're called, in Denmark or Saudi Arabia, Ukrainian side has often been quite open about this objective, that the goal is to show international support for Ukraine against the Russians. And this is why I think this conflict is fought mainly on 3 grounds. One is the battlefield, but NATO were losing there. The second is the efforts to crack or destroy the Russian economy. Obviously, we failed there too. And the third ground is the attempt to isolate Russia internationally, which is also failing. But this is, I think, the main purpose of this meeting, in order to conceal it also as a peace summit. That being said, I think also the public in Western countries are also expecting someone to talk about peace, because it's been more than 2 years. There seems to be no interest in even starting diplomacy, but we're more than willing to what's often seen as fighting to the last Ukrainian. So I think it's good for also public opinion to at least pretend to be pursuing peace.
Well, Peter, of course, do you think the absence of Russia in the conference make the meeting somehow more meaningful or less meaningful? When will be, say, the two sides ready, to talk to each other? If Ukraine seeks to talk to the Russians in a position of strength, and when that will be achieved?
Well, it's kind of a muddled issue at this point. I've heard some parties to the conference say that Russia, I think, was approached, but it was communicated that it would not participate. It's at this point, I think, a moot point to try to find out what really happened. But yes, to call them full-fledged peace talks without the participation of Russia is probably senseless, even though Vladimir Putin has communicated in one way or another that he would not, accept the legitimacy of these talks in the first place. And so I think when we will be finally ready to sit down is when Vladimir Putin decides that, he has achieved his goals in Ukraine. I think for now we can say that his goals remain maximalist. And I think it's borne out by his decision to visit for the first time in a quarter century, North Korea. It's obvious that Russia simply can't keep up with the level of intensity needed to continue conquering Ukraine's territory, even if it's only 100, 200 meters per day. He needs more ballistic missiles, more artillery shells from North Korea, and that just means that he is simply not willing to sit down and negotiate. Whatever his statements before the peace summit in Switzerland, proposing some sort of a format to reach peace with Ukraine, in my opinion, are meant to win time for Russia to engage in some sort of long drawn-out peace talks so he can rebuild his army and continue attacking Ukraine. So far, I'm just not seeing signs of a political will on the part of Moscow to wind this down.
Well, we'll come back to this, like the willingness to talk to each other. But before that, of course, earlier Peter mentioned about this participation by the global South developing nations, Anton, like big nations, India, Brazil, of course, like Indonesia, Mexico, UAE, and of course China received the participation but didn't show up there. But still, finally, at the final point, they refused to sign up to this communique. So there's a difference, and difference remain there, seems, between the global South and the West. I mean, what does that say about the overall situation here?
It says that the unipolar moment through which all of us on this show, and probably most of your viewers, have been living through over the past 30-odd years is over, and that countries of the global South, or the global majority, as some people call them, because that's where the bulk of the human population actually lives, outside of the billion that constitutes the West. These countries are forging their own geopolitical future. No longer do they feel like the United States sort of moving its little finger is the indisputable sort of mark of rightness and correctness. Everyone's making their own way. The de-dollarization, which is slowly gathering speed, is now a fact. If anyone had brought up this point even 10 years ago, they'd probably be laughed off the show, but no one's laughing about de-dollarization anymore as countries slowly switch over to their national currencies and trade. And so the global South, the global majority, sees this war as a war of NATO expansion, not as a war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine. And in that sense, the global South doesn't see any reason for it to take very strong positions, especially at its own cost and the cost of its people and its economic performance. The global South is looking at what's happening in Europe, where economies are slowing down and people are seriously talking about the deindustrialization of some of the most productive European economies, Germany being first and foremost. And I understand why the South Africans, the Brazilians, the Indians are rightfully asking themselves the question, why would we sever our economic relations with Russia when it will come at a cost to our own population over a war that is ultimately between NATO and Russia? And so I think you saw that being manifested in this at this peace conference. And one more thing just about the document. The intentions may be good, but unfortunately for Ukraine, again, it has absolutely no binding legal authority. This is not a UN Security Council resolution, and therefore this will come, this will go, and by the end of this week, we'll be back, those of us who are watching what's going on in Ukraine, we'll be back to talking about the remorseless progress that the Russian army is making in Kharkiv province and in the Donbass.
Well, Glenn, I mean, how big a deal is this rejection to sign up to these documents by the global South? I mean, major developing nations, mean to this conference? Does it make the conference less meaningful or less significant?
Well, I think it makes it less significant, and I think that's one of the problems of this conference to begin with. I think it was always a bit of a gamble. Now, I think that the main position of the global South is not necessarily a support of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because you've seen very little of this, even from China, which is probably the most important partner of Russia. They haven't uttered any support for the invasion. But as we all see across the global South, there's also this reluctance to support NATO's proxy war against Russia. And I think correctly, this war has largely been a NATO proxy war against Russia. And Kishore Mahbubani, the Singaporean diplomat and former president of the UN Security Council, he kind of made this point as well, that nobody in the global south would want to see NATO being able to defeat Russia, because this would result in an intolerant hubris on the part of the West, and the West would see this as an effort, as an opportunity to restore unipolarity and take us back to the 90s. So I think that this was the main view of most of the global south, and it's a very correct one. So I'm not really sure why they would have taken this gamble to begin with, because for me it seems as if they already put the bar very low in terms of the substance, because we saw, for the Ukrainians, sovereignty and territorial integrity was really their main focus. But at the end, the three crucial topics which were listed in this communique were, no attacks on nuclear installations, securing global food security, exchanging prisoners of war, things everyone could agree with, and still it was very difficult to rally much support. So I think it was probably a mistake, because it showed how much NATO's position in Ukraine actually lacks international support. So I think it could have been counterproductive and temporary effort to draw attention to a war which is being lost.
Yeah, speak of that, Glenn, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg spoke on Monday in Washington that, you mentioned China here. He said China is fueling the largest armed conflict in Europe since World War II. At some point, unless China changes course, allies need to impose a cost. He also talked about, the justification of expanding NATO to Asia. What do you make of his remarks?
Well, overall, I think it's NATO, it still calls itself a defensive alliance, but even when it talks about deterrence, it uses it increasingly in an offensive way. For example, with Russia, we presented them with a dilemma. They can either accept NATO's incursion into Ukraine, which they consider to be an existential threat, or they could use military force. Again, a decision they didn't want. They're doing the same now with China to a large extent. They're giving them an ultimatum. Either you can accept gradually trying to sever Taiwan from China, or China can use force. But we're always going to try, NATO's going to try to deter effectively responding to NATO. So it's unfortunate that NATO's beginning to take a greater push into Asia as well. And again, I think that China's position has been very similar to the global south. It doesn't support Russia's invasion, but it doesn't support NATO's proxy war against Russia either. So I think this is also probably a strategic mistake on behalf of the West, which is usually like the dominant power. If you want to pursue a divide and conquer, you go after one country at a time. But in this instance, we appear to be going after the Russians, the Chinese, Iranians, all at the same time, which is actually pushing these states together. And it is also a bit hypocritical for Jens Stoltenberg to criticize, because NATO has been pumping all the weapons it has into this war, while the Chinese have been calling for peace negotiation, actual peace negotiations, which the West didn't even want to discuss. So I don't really see the moral high ground which Stoltenberg appears to be attempting to claim.
Mm-hmm. Well, back to this, this peace future, a potential, Anton. Of course, one day ahead of the conference, President Putin made his own proposal about how to start in the talks between the two nations there. He talked about, of course, the withdrawal of Ukraine troops from the 5 or 4 regions in the east, and disarming and abandoning NATO goals, things like that. I think, understandably, President Zelensky rejected all the offers there. But still, that's expected response from the Ukrainian side. Why did Russia put out such a proposal at all?
Well, this is simply sending a signal to the West that the Russians, are willing to discuss peace, but on their terms, not on the terms that we were hearing about at the peace summit in Switzerland. But number two, I think there's a more severe undertext to this, which is that the Russians are willing to continue fighting until the Ukrainians and the NATO, the broader West, are ready to start negotiating. The expectation in the West is that the Russians are simply going to surrender, capitulate, and withdraw. That would make sense if they were losing the war and if they were on their last legs. But economically, geopolitically, and militarily, everything is in the Russians' court right now. So there's no reason for them to compromise. Moreover, the Russians can point to the Minsk II agreement, which, by the way, was ratified by the UN Security Council and therefore did have the status of international law that was not fulfilled. They can also point to the negotiations that started immediately after the invasion in March of 2022, from which the Ukrainians walked away. And remember that Volodymyr Zelensky signed a decree forbidding anyone within his government to negotiate with the Russians after they annexed extra two territories, Zaporizhia and Kherson provinces. So with all of that, plus the fact that the Russians are remorselessly moving forward and destroying the Ukrainian army, I think that Putin decided to throw this sort of narrative grenade into the amidst the peace summit, to which Russia was not invited, to simply see what the reactions will be. Either way, I don't think that this proposal is going to have any immediate consequences. The Russians will simply keep doing what they've been doing because so far it's working for them.
Well, Peter, look at the battlefield, the battleground, of course, with this recent development, the green lighting from the Western nations, Ukraine could use their weapons to attack targets inside Russia. Are we seeing, the change of tide on the battlefield?
We are seeing a change of tide on the battlefield of sorts, and contrary to what the Professor Fedyashin was saying, and we've been on this program together with him several times. He's been saying over the past 2 years that Russia's progress is inexorable. I mean, if you were to take his word at face value, I mean, Russia would have reached the borders of Western Europe by now, and Ukraine would have ceased to exist. The second largest army, is this inexorable, progress of which the professor speaks is a few hundred meters every day. By all accounts, its counteroffensive in Kharkiv has sputtered out. It's not really proceeding anywhere. And yes, Ukraine has been able to achieve certain progress with this lifting of this absurd, absurd limitation on what it can do and how far it can use the Western army. Listen, this has become a war of attrition. And, once both sides or one of the sides runs out of steam, yes, it will have to come to the negotiating tables. But once again, let's not be fooled by any promises by Vladimir Putin. Before he said he was never attacked Ukraine, he attacked Ukraine. He said it was never about territory, and now he wants to offer peace in return for territory. Vladimir Putin is a liar. And once again, let's not lose sight of the moral goalposts here. Why is Vladimir Putin in Ukraine? If you accept his rationale that he's here to fight the Nazis, then it is absurd. And I think that this is evident to all the world. This is just pure propaganda. The war will stop once Vladimir Putin withdraws his troops. He has invaded a sovereign state, a member of the United Nations. He's trying to redraw the world order. And if he succeeds, this will not be a happy place, I guarantee you.
Well, Peter, of course, you talk about this war of attrition. We are also seeing, more challenges for the Ukrainians. For example, the conscription, for the, the man aged 18 to 60. We see reports now coming out like the challenges for the country to, recruit the young people to go to the front line. How much a challenge is that? And also at the same time, there are different developments. And like, for example, relationship with the U.S., with the likelihood for Trump coming back to the White House. I mean, how big a factor is that? You know, what's the concern? How big a concern is that for the Ukrainians?
Well, first of all, let me just correct you there. The conscription age is 25. I mean, the 18 to 61 is men who are not able to leave the country.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes, but you served at the age of 25. It was lowered from the previous 27. Yes, Ukraine has a significant demographic problem, recruiting from the pool of young men. Russia does as well, but Russia's population is 5 to 6 times that of Ukraine. So, and Russia has money to offer its recruits. Ukraine doesn't. Which leads me to the point that if this war were to be won by Ukraine, sooner or later NATO will have to introduce its troops to Ukraine, or if it doesn't, then it's going to be very difficult. I'm not going to lie to you and create any illusions about this. And now, when it comes to Donald Trump and the second term, once again, Donald Trump thrives on unpredictability. I'm not a big fan or supporter of Donald Trump, but keep in mind that it is under Trump's administration that Ukraine had a limited number of javelins given to it, which didn't happen under President Obama. And so, also keep in mind that certain of the Republican rank and file in Congress and Senate have been making much stronger statements in support of Ukraine, criticizing Democrats, in effect, for dragging their feet and not providing Ukraine with all the help that it needs. So let's not to jump to any foregone conclusions about what Trump is going to do or not do should he win the second term.
Well, Glenn, of course, there are a variety of factors to be taken into consideration. I mean, the challenges inside the country. The possibility of Trump returning to the White House, and of course the recent election in the European Parliament inside the European Union. So what do you see as the possible future? Some analysts say if Trump comes back to the White House, that will lead to the disappearance of Ukraine from the geopolitical map. I mean, Trump himself talked about ending the war in 24 hours in multiple occasions. What do you see as a possible scenario, say in a couple of years maybe, or even within a year?
Well, I agree on what was said about Trump. He's always been very unpredictable, and I don't think it matters that much who sits on the throne either. The presidents change, but the policies tend to remain the same. Now, Trump is, he can oppose weapons to Ukraine one day, but then support it on the next. So. But the main tool he has to achieve his 24-hour goal, which I don't think he would be against the Ukrainians, because for Russia this is deemed to be an existential threat. They can't accept NATO in Ukraine. But the US have also ample influence over Ukraine. It keeps it afloat. So given that Trump doesn't care too much about NATO, I think it would probably result in wanting to get an end to this war by putting pressure on Ukraine and cutting some funding there. But again, this is just speculations because it's very difficult to predict what Trump's going to do. Of course, for Biden, I think it's important to keep Ukraine afloat at least until the elections, as a defeat there would be quite devastating. But depends how this war will develop, because the idea now is Russia really dominates in all areas with artillery, armored vehicle. It controls the skies. It dominates in drones, missiles, electronic warfare, and as was also mentioned, manpower. And the key problem now for Ukraine is the lack of mechanized vehicles, but also manpower. They're not able to get this back. And as was also mentioned, this is a war of attrition. So looking this 200 meters a day doesn't really mean that much, because in a war of attrition, you don't want to storm the front lines if you're going to take high casualties, because this is a war where you bleed the adversary dry. So what you see is once the adversary has been weakened, that's when you take the territory. That's also why they opened the new front line in Kharkov.
We have to stop there. On that note, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.